Okay guys, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar with myself, John Cooper, and today I have with me philosopher Alex Epstein. Alex founded the Centre for Industrial Progress in 2011 to offer a positive, pro-human alternative to the Green Movement, and argues that human flourishing should be the guiding principle of industrial and environmental progress. Alex is the host of two podcasts, Power Hour and the Human Flourishing Project, and we'll be talking about his New York Times best-selling book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, published in 2014, which has been widely recognised as the most persuasive argument ever made for our continuing use of fossil fuels. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here.
Great to have you, Alex. Now, when I heard the title of your book, A Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, even though I've researched into this and I've come to similar conclusions, there was a part of me that was still had that little knee-jerk reaction of like, oof, can you say that? You know, it's been so drummed into me, so conditioned into me that I wasn't even aware of that little knee-jerk reaction that I had, you know? And so that must be something that we all have on some level. We have this sort of programming that we have that little reaction to based upon our education, based on culture, based on, peer pressure of that kind of that way of thinking. So I wanted to really get into the heart of this with you and try and like unpack this and unravel this. And I think a great way to start is actually what I really liked was the last sentence of your book. I wanted to actually start with that. And I just want to read this out for everyone because I think this frames your book, and also it's going to frame the podcast nicely. And it goes as follows. Mankind's use of fossil fuels is supremely virtuous because human life is the standard of value and because using fossil fuels transforms our environment to make it wonderful for human life. And that's fascinating because this is the basis of your book. It's looking at fossil fuels as a way to improve human life. And you use the word human flourishing, and that's the name of your podcast as well. Now, can we basically, firstly, lay out for a basic layman's of just what are fossil fuels, and can we expand on the idea of what does that mean in terms of flourishing for humans?
Can I break protocol and just start with something a little bit different?
Okay.
Because I think it'll help frame it.
Oh, go on then. Yes, please.
Part of the quote.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely, because part of the quote that might jump out at people who haven't read the book. If they've read the book, they definitely know where I'm coming from. But talking about making our environment wonderful for human life, that's something that you don't hear very much. I mean, if somebody said, hey, we have a wonderful environment today, that's not what you hear at all, right? We hear that our environment is getting much worse, that the earth is getting much worse. And a survey I learned about recently, which I find very revealing, so I keep mentioning it now in interviews that I do, is there was a survey by Oxford University of college-educated adults, I think in Europe. So these, it's Oxford, and they asked people what's happening to extreme poverty around the world. So extreme poverty is people living on less than $2 a day. And the question is, over the last 30 years or so, has it A, gotten worse, B, stayed the same, or C, gotten better? And so 55% of the college-educated adults said it's gotten worse, 33% said it stayed the same, and 12% said it's gotten better. So you think about that. And so that's definitely what we're taught today by our trusted sources, not by some crazy things on the internet, but the mainstream trusted sources, what I call our mainstream knowledge system. The institutions like New York Times and Washington Post, and of course in different countries it'll be different, but they're giving us this perspective that the world is getting to be a worse and worse place to live, and things like extreme poverty are getting worse. Now, Oxford University tracks this kind of data, and so what they said, the truth is actually that extreme poverty is getting better. And not only is it getting better, it's getting better in a miraculous way. So to give you my own, I think of it in terms of my own birth. I was born, I'm actually going to be 40 in a week. So I was born August 1st, 1980. In 1980, more than 4 out of 10 people lived on less than $2 a day. So think about that, 4 out of 10. What does it mean to live in extreme poverty? I mean, this is like if you're living in any kind of home, it's just a tiny home. You might have 7 people crowded into a 10-foot by 10-foot space. If you make it really concrete, like less than $2 a day, it's just unimaginable for most of us in the wealthy world. That was 4 out of 10 people. And now it's less than 1 out of 10 people, 40 years later. So you think about that. And if you think about that from the perspective of our environment, or the planet, you sometimes hear it as, the planet is a much better place to live for human beings than it was 40 years ago. And I think that I just wanted to frame everything around that, because the perspective we're given is the perspective that the college educated adults had in this survey, which is a completely false perspective. The perspective that the world is a bad place to live and getting worse. The world has never been a better place for human beings to live. So if you care about human life and that's your primary standard by which you're evaluating things, you have to say today's world is amazing. It doesn't mean you have no concerns about the future. We can talk about things like rising CO2 levels, but you have to recognize whatever we've done that's bad so far, the good has far outweighed it. And I think it's important to get into fossil fuels from that perspective, because if you think the world is already getting worse because of fossil fuels, then you're not going to be open to the idea that fossil fuels are good. But if you recognize the earth is actually better than ever and improving rapidly, and fossil fuels are a major part of it, then you might be open to the idea that, hey, wait, there is a moral case for continuing to use fossil fuels and maybe even using more.
Absolutely. And you actually mentioned in the book about there's a correlation between the increase in fossil fuels and life expectancy. I think you mentioned China and India. You also talk about infant mortality rate plummeting. I think 70% and 58%, I think, respective of the two countries there. You also talk about average, or did I mention average income? So yes, life expectancy, average income, and infant mortality rates. And those are just a few that you've mentioned. But is there any other things that people can really tangibly hang their hat on?
Yeah. Because it's what I call the human flourishing hockey stick. So human flourishing, I like that term because it captures flourishing means to exist at your highest potential, whether it's an animal or a plant or human. So the idea, and this is probably very consistent with what you guys are trying to do, if you're called menprovement, right? It's the idea is what enables human beings to live to their highest potential. And if you look at the state of the world, like over the last 2,000 years, there are these great graphs that I call the human flourishing hockey sticks. And I call them hockey sticks because they look like a hockey stick, which means they're flat. And then there's a blade at the end, which means a dramatic accelerated increase in something. And so what you see is you see that life expectancy for 2,000 years is flat. And then there's this dramatic increase. And then so that's how long people can live. And then you look at income. So that's how much resources the average individual has. And it's like this. And then you look at how many people are on the planet, which you could think of in a sense as how many people the planet can support. And it's flat, like 500 million or so. And then it goes all the way up to 8 billion. So what we have today empirically is we have almost 8 billion people. And by the common logic that we hear about, oh, the planet is finite, resources are limited, we're depleting it, you would think, well, if there are more of us, life must be getting worse. We must be poorer. But no, wait, in fact, we're living way longer. So our life expectancy is from 30 to over 70, and we're much wealthier. So average income is something like $8,000, but that's up from well under $1,000 to 2,000 years ago, or even really 250 years ago. So we have this amazing situation where there are more people who are living longer with more resources. And that's just a factual specification of how amazing the world is and why we should be super interested in A, what causes that, and B, what's very related, what's necessary for it to continue. And if you just think about how our knowledge system works, there's no concern for this whatsoever. Nobody is interested in the fact that life is amazing and getting better. It's all a focus on let's find things that are going wrong, act like everything is getting worse, and then have some crazy call to change the system in some dramatic way, usually involving giving a lot of people who have very little competence power over everybody. Whereas if you recognize whatever's going wrong with today's systems, and I think there is a lot going wrong, the effect is we still have the best world ever and it's rapidly improving. That leads to an appreciation for what makes the world so good. And that should be I think the most important question in the world is what makes the world so good? And if we can answer that, including so rapidly improving, because if we can answer that, then we can continue this amazing ride. Yeah. And we have such a good thing going. We really need to appreciate it.
Absolutely. I know at the beginning of your book, you mentioned a girl that you spoke to. I think she had a stall and she was working for Greenpeace. She was handing out leaflets, and I think she was trying to give you a leaflet, and you said something like, "Well, actually, I'm in support of fossil fuels," and you actually had prepared for her very carefully responses to the certain things that you'd expect if there was actually going to be some kind
Well,
of,
I was just prepared. I didn't know I was going to meet her. I was just
yeah,
prepared because I think about this all the time.
exactly. Yeah. And so one of those was, the fact that it could cause pollution, obviously quite a sensible thing to, state, causing climate change, the fact they're not non-renewable, and the fact they can be replaceable by solar and wind. And you just got the answer, you must be making a lot of money. And that was quite telling. And
Yeah, I mean,
actually
I think
quite,
that's a really. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
well, I
What
was
were
going
you
to say
gonna say?
that's quite an indictment of where we're at in society, and I don't think that she's on her own by saying that. I think that's actually a general consensus opinion. But what I would actually like to investigate with you is actually go over those talking points, the four that you actually
Yeah.
had prepared, and expand on them a little bit more.
Yeah, and I want to answer your question earlier about you
Mm.
asked what are fossil fuels? I think
Yeah,
that's a good kind of question because
yeah,
one thing that's notable is we talk about fossil fuels, and if you actually ask people like what are fossil fuels,
yes, exactly.
they don't know. I mean,
Mm.
even in the US, one of our most prominent political officials is named Nancy Pelosi. So she's a longtime leader of I don't mean to make this political, she's a longtime leader of Democrats in the United States House of Representatives. And she like said, oh, we need to get away from fossil fuels and start using natural gas.
Mm.
And she didn't realize, oh, natural gas is one of the three fossil fuels. So that just shows, I mean, that's somebody who's been in huge positions of power and there's just not much clarity. So fossil fuels, so one way to think of it is the three fossil fuels are oil, coal, and gas. And so oil is a liquid, coal is a solid, and natural gas is a gas. Obviously, and the interesting, and so a couple of things about them. Over 80% of the energy that we use in the world. So you can think of energy as what powers our machines. I like to call it machine food because it really captures what it does. Just like our bodies need food to operate, our machines need food to operate. So 80% of the world's machine calories come from oil, coal, and gas. And also, they're also, interestingly, the fastest growing source of energy in the world, which most people don't know. So if you think about 80% means the fossil fuels produce more energy than every alternative combined times 4. So they're really the overwhelming source of energy, and they're still the fastest growing source of energy. So more machine calories are added every year from fossil fuels than everything else. And one thing to know about what they are concretely that helps explain why they're so popular is they are, another term for them is called hydrocarbons. And this captures a lot about both their benefits, but also their potential side effects. So a hydrocarbon is a combination of hydrogen atoms and carbon atoms. And it also involves some other stuff with it too, but it's mainly those. So they're hydrocarbons. And the other thing is they're derived from ancient life. So these are the two things to get about them. I'll explain why in a second. So it's these kinds of molecules, these hydrocarbon molecules, and they come from ancient life. So they can come often from ancient dead plants or what's called plankton, which are these very small microorganisms. And basically the whole history is that this compresses, as this ancient dead life got very compressed by natural forces into this dense form. So if you think of wood, like that's a form of energy that you can burn, whereas coal and oil in particular are much more condensed than wood. Part of it is they don't have much water in them like wood does, which makes it harder to burn. So they're more like charcoal, but they're even better than charcoal. So basically nature sort of compressed all these plants and into a very small space. And that is part of what is really desirable about these fossil fuels is they store a lot of energy in a small space. Oil is the most notable example of this because oil is used for mobility. And when you're moving around, you always have to carry your fuel with you. So the lighter the fuel and the less space the fuel takes up, so this is called the higher the energy density, the easier it is to be mobile. And you see this with electric vehicles where it's not too hard to have a battery-powered golf cart. When you start to have a battery-powered automobile, the batteries are getting better. It can't go as far as a gasoline or a diesel automobile. But once you get into things like trucks and, large trucks and certainly cargo ships and airplanes, like those aren't using batteries at all because oil can store much more energy in a smaller space than say a battery can. So it's these hydrocarbon molecules tend to store a lot of energy in a small space. and they come from this ancient life. And part of the reason it's important that they come from this ancient life is if you look at what plants are made of, they have things in them like sulfur and nitrogen. So if you take sulfur, like sulfur is essential to the plant's life, but when we burn the fossil fuel, the sulfur can get released in the air and it combines with oxygen to become something called sulfur dioxide. And so that's the kind of concern about pollution that's a legitimate concern. When you're burning this ancient dead life, if you have too high a concentration of the sulfur, then that can cause things like smog. And that's undesirable. The other thing related to the hydrocarbon is when you burn the fossil fuel, what happens is the hydrogen atom and carbon atom splits off and they combine with oxygen. So the hydrogen becomes water, H2O, which people don't care about too much, but the carbon becomes CO2. So, and that's the molecule that people are really concerned about. So when we burn fossil fuels, we add CO2 to the atmosphere. And if you look over the past couple hundred years, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone from about 0.03% of the atmosphere to 0.04%. And because CO2 is what's called a greenhouse gas or a warming gas, there's concern about, well, what is this doing to our climate system? And that's an important kind of thing to investigate. And just one thing I would say about how to investigate it, though, is we want to investigate it the same way we'd investigate a life-saving drug, which is that we would look at both the benefits and the side effects, and we would try to do them proportionally with precision. So it's really important if we're taking, say, an antibiotic to know, okay, what's the benefit of this and what's the side effect? And we don't want to exaggerate the benefit, and we don't want to exaggerate the side effect, and we don't want to underestimate the benefit. We don't want to underestimate the side effect. And one thing I found when I started studying energy was that there was a big tendency with fossil fuels and nuclear energy to only focus on the side effects. And with solar and wind energy, there was a tendency to only focus on the benefits. And I was really interested in, like, how do we focus on the benefits and side effects with precision?
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty crazy to me that we've got to that stage. And actually, you were also talking about the fact that there's a big push for wind and solar energy, renewable energy, but in many cases, because it's intermittent energy, it needs a backup energy of fossil fuel energy just to keep it running in the times when it can't run on its own. And by doing that, actually expends more energy.
Yeah, so I mean, one issue, if you're talking about the benefits of fossil fuels, is I'd say the dominant view now is, well, there really are no benefits, because even if we get energy from fossil fuels, that energy can be easily replaced by preferable alternatives, namely solar and wind, which are often called renewables. One thing that's interesting about that characterization that we can dive into is that hydroelectric energy is generally not considered, doesn't qualify as renewable, even though it's even more renewable than solar and wind. I mean, it just comes from, rainfall and falling water and rivers. So it's interesting, and we can talk about why later, but that solar and wind are the focus. And I actually have a kind of mean name for solar and wind, but I think it's accurate, and I call them unreliables. And the reason is because the energy that we get from the sun and the wind, if you're thinking about sunlight or gusts of wind, it comes in an intermittent fashion that for human purposes is unreliable. So one crucial aspect of all types of energy, but particularly electricity, which is where part of solar and wind is actually they don't produce all types of energy, which people don't realize. Like, we use energy to make steel or cement, what's called industrial process heat energy, and there's no solar or wind solution for them whatsoever, unless, well, you could theoretically use electricity to do some of that stuff, but it's way more expensive. And then a lot of the mobility stuff, there's no solar plane or electric cargo ship. So when people talk about replacement, we should just even think about, what about replacing the things that aren't electricity? And it's revealing that people talk about, oh, let's get rid of fossil fuels, and they don't think about how are we going to replace mobility, how are we going to replace industry. But even if we just look at electricity, one of its key attributes is it needs extreme reliability, because the way electricity works is essentially there's a certain amount of demand that we have for electricity. And what the power plants need to do is they need to produce precisely the amount of supply that we are demanding at a given moment. And if our needs go up, it needs to adjust up. And if our needs go down, it needs to adjust down. It needs to do it very quickly. And if it doesn't have enough it can lead to big problems like blackouts. And if it has too much, if it's producing too much at a given time, it can lead to all kinds of problems as well. And so with solar and wind, if you recognize that the value they need to produce is reliable electricity, you need to think about how are these unreliable inputs going to produce a reliable output, right? And so there are really only three theoretical possibilities. So one, which used to be talked about and isn't talked about that much, is what you can call relying on far away unreliables. So relying on far away unreliables means, yeah, the sun and the wind may not be working where you are, but if we interconnect the world enough, then it's always going to be shining somewhere. It's always going to be blowing somewhere. So if we interconnect everything, then everyone will have enough electricity. If you just think about that, it's not very plausible because you would have to just radically overbuild in every area enough to basically supply huge portions of the world. So you have to build so many solar panels and wind turbines. You have to connect them all. And this has not worked at all. And there's no project even to do this anywhere. So people make up fantasies about it, but this relying on faraway unreliables, nobody is actually doing it. It's just so cost prohibitive. The other thing you might think of is, what about relying on storage? And this is a kind of plausible one that I think most people think works pretty well. So if instead of basically, yeah, the input is unreliable, but if we can store enough of it, then we can just get it whenever we need and make it reliable. And this makes a certain amount of theoretical sense. The question is just, how much does it cost to actually store it? So what you have to do is you have to dramatically overbuild the solar panels and the wind turbines so that you generate not just what you need at the maximum, you need to generate way more than that so that you can store enough for when there's no sun and no wind, which is actually most of the time. So there's that whole expense. But the main thing is the batteries. And just to give you a sense of what the batteries cost, if you were to somehow convert the whole world to electricity, and you were to use today's like best battery prices, and you just had 3 days of storage, which you might not be comfortable with, like just 3 days worth stored up, you might want more. The figure is about $300 trillion. And that lasts 10 years because batteries last about 10 years. So I forget exactly the GDP of the world, but it's something like $100 trillion a year. So, I mean, this is just something where energy would be, it'd just be complete, like nobody could afford any energy, basically. It's just, it has nothing resembling a replacement, because a replacement for fossil fuels doesn't just mean it can produce energy. It means it can produce energy that people can afford and use. And we're in a world where 3 billion people have virtually no energy right now. So the basically relying on man-made storage is just completely cost prohibitive given the cost of storing energy. Now, the third thing that you can do, and the thing that actually happens in practice, is what I call relying on reliables. So the way, and you indicated this one. So this means, how do you turn the unreliable input into a reliable output? Well, basically, you just get a reliable power plant to give you life support all the time. So the way it works is conventionally with a natural gas plant. So you have, let's say, your solar panels and your wind turbines. Let's just take wind. So when the wind is blowing, a lot, maybe if like the maximum of the wind blowing is the maximum that you need, then maybe you would shut off your natural gas plant at the time. And then when the wind isn't blowing, then you have to run the natural gas plant. And when the wind goes down, you have to put the gas plant up. And the wind goes up, you have to put the gas plant down. And so there are a couple of things about this. One is that this is not a replacement for fossil fuels. It's just a supplement for fossil fuels. The second thing is it's very duplicative in terms of infrastructure, because you not only have to buy the reliable energy infrastructure, you still have to buy the gas plant, but then you also have to buy the wind turbines, and then you have to buy all the infrastructure. So the cost of the infrastructure is reliable infrastructure plus unreliable infrastructure. Whereas you might ask, well, why don't you just buy the reliable infrastructure and then you don't need the unreliable infrastructure? And then the third thing is, you might think, oh, well, I'm going to save a lot of fuel because every time I need to use less gas, I'm going to save fuel. But if you think about cycling up and down, it's a lot like driving in stop and go traffic. So it's very fuel inefficient to keep having to adjust up and down in order to accommodate the unreliable wind. And so what happens is you use the natural gas very inefficiently, and also you put a lot of wear and tear on these plants. And when you're using nuclear plants and coal plants, it's even worse because they're worse at cycling up and down. So you just have all these travesties around the country where we're totally abusing our existing reliable infrastructure and we're wearing it out. And so that is added cost. And so the sum total of what's going on with solar and wind in the world is solar and wind are nowhere coming close to replacing fossil fuels. They're just supplementing fossil fuels, but they're doing it at a very high cost. So the more unreliables you use, the higher your costs are. So if anyone is concerned with replacing fossil fuels, there's no way to do that with today's technology and economics with unreliables. You would need something reliable, which you could talk about hydro and nuclear, at least as candidates there. But notice the whole focus of our discussion is these unreliables, and there's almost a fetish. And it really has the quality of a fetish where it's, oh, we have to use the sun, we have to use the wind. And I think that is ultimately because there's a religious component of it where people want to be natural, and that's their priority versus actually doing what's good for human life.
Yeah, it's almost as if their compassion has been weaponized and their common sense has been thrown out the window a little bit. And I think it's almost emotion first, common sense second. And I think
what do you mean by the compassion being weaponized?
Well, I've explained that because I think that people have a natural tendency and propensity towards being compassionate for their fellow man, for the planet. I think we all have that. Well, most people have that to a certain degree. Okay, so if you can create a movement which harnesses that, which actually tells people, if you want to be a good person, I would suggest that you look into solar and wind energy, renewable energy. People automatically see that as an immediate go-to, because that makes sense to everyone. Looking after the planet, taking care of everyone, making sure we're not exploiting, the resources. People's natural ambient level of compassion is being used, and I think exploited, to funnel people into this agenda, I believe. And
but I think it reveals. So, I mean, it's one thing to say that, because you can weaponize compassion, direct compassion for human life. And I think that's one where it's very easy to understand. Like you see, for example, if we look at, say, the anti-fossil fuel movement, they'll say something like, oh, here's a community in, let's say, the Congo, and if climate warms X amount, and we speculate there are going to be more storms, then their life is going to get much worse. And then and insofar as that isn't true, I think it's A, not very true, but B, people in the Congo need energy a lot more than they need an unchanging climate. They can't deal with any climate because they have so little energy and so little machine power. So that's a kind of weaponizing where you're focused on human lives. So what's interesting about the renewables is, you said like exploiting our resources. There's just this, I think the reason
that's the way they think, that's the way that people are programmed.
I think it's really, there's a deep false idea that we have, which is that impacting the planet is bad and ultimately self-destructive. And this is an idea I'm really at war against. And if you take this idea of self-destructive, it's the idea that, for instance, you mentioned exploiting resources. Like if we take too many resources from the planet, that's not only wrong for us to do, but we're going to run out of resources. And then what you find historically as well, we're taking a lot more, so to speak, all the time, and we keep running into resources. So how is that working? And the way that works, it's not just, oh, we're about to run out and we overestimated the stockpile. The whole way resources work is resources are overwhelmingly human creations. The thing that nature gives us is it gives us raw matter and energy. So if you take something like aluminum, is aluminum a natural resource? Well, people would say, yeah, of course it's a natural resource, but it's not. Aluminum, it's a very common material element in the earth, but it was naturally useless. People didn't know how to harness it. Once you develop through ingenuity the means of creating value from it, then it's a resource. The same is true of oil, coal, gas, uranium or thorium, which are the basis of nuclear power, nuclear energy. So the way resources work is there's basically an unlimited amount of raw matter and energy in nature, and we're continually getting more, including through the sun. And so what we do is we just figure out intelligent ways to manipulate that matter to be resources. And if you view resources as human creations and ultimately creations of the mind, you stop thinking in terms of exploiting the earth and you start thinking in terms of creating new value. So in a sense, if you think about exploiting the earth, it's in the good sense of exploiting an opportunity. It's not in the sense of you're harming it, or you're somehow harming yourself by ruining your future. But I do think this is the view of the earth, and I call it the perfect planet premise. So it's the idea that a planet without human impact is a perfect planet. And so it's a stable planet, and it's a safe planet, and it's a sufficient planet. It gives us what we need as long as we don't consume too much. And I think this is totally false. And you can see this through the hockey sticks I gave before. When we had a very low impact on the planet, we lived very short lives. The planet could support very few of us, and we had very little resources. We had very few opportunities. It's only once we figured out how to intelligently transform the planet, including figuring out how to turn things like coal and oil and gas into machine power, and then having machines do a lot of work on the planet for us, that we became very, very prosperous. So I'm very at war with this idea that the planet is perfect and we ruin it. I believe in the imperfect planet premise. So I believe nature it's not stable, it's dynamic. I don't believe it's safe. I believe it's dangerous. And I don't believe it's sufficient, it's deficient. And if you have the imperfect planet, dynamic, dangerous, deficient, then you start really valuing intelligent impact on the planet. And you realize that when somebody talks about, oh, I'm not going to impact the planet, I'm going to be natural, you start to see that as genocidal. So when I hear that, like when I hear, oh, let's just use renewable, let's just use the sun and the wind, like I think, oh, you want to kill a bunch of people.
Yeah, that's how it should be. Yeah, that's how we should sort of flip it back on them. Yeah, make them think from that perspective. Yeah, absolutely. I remember in your book, you talk about how these people are actually, they're anti-life, they're anti-human, because they're seeing nature first, human life second, whereas we should be seeing things as human flourishing, human life first, and transforming our environment to create the best habitat that we can create, with obviously with limits, but that should be the right way round, as opposed to nature first and then human second, right? And that's what you would call anti-human, anti-life, that I think you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, now let me make clear who I'm attributing this to, because definitely not everyone who finds solar energy appealing, or who finds we haven't talked much about man-made climate change, which I hope we do, but who finds that concerning. But I would put it as the thought leaders of our culture on energy and environmental issues. I think there's a deep anti-humanity to them. And I think the biggest piece of evidence is their characterization of today's planet as bad and getting worse. So it's one thing to be concerned about the future and to say, hey, I'm concerned about a trend. If they said the following, and they said, yes, today's planet is the best place ever. Human beings have done amazing things. We've created this amazing world. We should be very proud of it, including what we've done with fossil fuels. Nature is not a good place to live. We should never want to return to nature. There are billions of people who have to live in nature. They should get out of nature. We should do everything we can to help them. Nothing. Like if they said that, they recognize, okay, today's planet is amazing. It's getting better. But I'm concerned that even though we've had rising CO2 levels for 170 years and life keeps getting better, and they should acknowledge that, but I think the next level of rise in CO2 levels is going to be a problem. That's a coherent kind of position, but that's not what they say. They say we've destroyed the planet, we've wrecked it, we've ruined it. So they take today's planet, which is the most human-friendly planet in history, and they say it's bad. Now, if you say the most human-friendly planet in history is a bad planet, then the standard by which you're evaluating the planet cannot be human life or human flourishing. So it raises the question of, by what standard are you evaluating the planet? I mentioned before the standard of natural. And now natural is an interesting term because it implies often that human beings are unnatural, which I don't like. I think of us as like, we build the best nests, not we're unnatural. I think we're the best part of nature. So one way you can think of it as their standard as unchanged nature or unimpacted nature. So the standard by which they're judging the planet is how little have human beings changed it. And they see, hey, we've changed the planet a lot in the last 200 years. And they think that change is immoral, not because it's bad for us, but just because it's immoral. It's as if there were a modern environmental commandment that said, thou shalt not impact the earth. And it's like, we just violated the hell out of that commandment for 200 years. And they're like, well, you're going to go to hell. right? You have to go to hell. Like if this is your religion, thou shalt not impact. And we've done what we've done. We have dramatically impacted this planet. There's no question. Like you're going to hell. And I think you can think of it as a religion. If you want to think of it in a more secular way, you can think of it as a framework. And I think the basic elements of the framework. So the framework is a starting structure that you use it can be to build something, but including to build a thought process. The basic value of their framework is unchanged nature. So we need to minimize our impact on nature. And then their basic premise that I mentioned earlier, the perfect planet premise, is if we do the wrong thing and impact the planet, then it has to be bad. It's inevitably self-destructive. We have to go to hell. So it really is this religion. It amounts to a religion of we shouldn't be impacting the planet. And if we do, we're going to be going to hell. And so I view that as, I call that the anti-impact framework or the anti-human impact framework. But it is a very deeply anti-human idea. If you think human impact is bad, I realized this when I was 18. I didn't know anything about energy, but I learned this and it stuck with me. And 22 years later, if you think human impact is bad and human impact is how humans survive, then you think human survival is bad. And that's anti-human. So that's why I think the leadership is anti-human. But what they've done is they have anti-human goals. They ultimately want to see a planet with far fewer human beings doing far less. But most human beings won't accept that. And so they offer these seemingly human considerations for following their policies. So they'll say, oh, well, if you just outlaw fossil fuels or you rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, don't worry, we'll have this wonderful world of solar and wind. And then you look into that, okay, that's total BS. That's not going to happen at all. But people think it is. And so that's the appeal. And then they say, well, if you don't rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, then you're going to have an unlivable climate. So they're in both cases, both directions, whether it's replacing fossil fuels or fossil fuels having catastrophic side effects, they're offering us a human incentive for following an anti-human value, which is you can think of it as a dehumanized planet, unchanged nature. That means dehumanizing the planet. So I think it's that religion, that framework that's driving the leaders, but that most of us are suckers in the sense of they're manipulating our concern for human life to contradict human life. And this happens all the time in history. Like people join movements, they think they're doing the right thing, and they end up participating in communism and being part of slaughtering 100 million people.
Exactly. I mean, we actually talked about this on a previous show. We talked about the most destructive ideologies are often window dressed with the most virtuous, noble, soft, compassionate, gentle, caring, kind front shop window.
Yes.
Because it's easy for that to pass through the defenses. People's guards are down to those certain things, such as Greta Thunberg, little 16-year-old girl. Who's going to say anything bad against little Greta? That's almost like the symbol, the icon of the movement itself.
One thing about Greta that's interesting, though, is there's this positive. I think this is true of other movements too. There's this sometimes there's this positive appeal that they make. Okay, we're going to have a cleaner and better planet, and everything we like about the planet is going to stay, and then everything we're afraid of in terms of climate is going to be bad. So there's some positive. There's a lot of fear, though. There's a lot of just making people afraid and trying to compel them through their fear about themselves or fear about others. And related to that, there's a lot of shaming involved, a lot of guilt and a lot of shaming. And that's what Greta is really doing. Because it's not as if Greta's an appealing figure. I mean, she's appealing in the sense that she seems courageous. Like that's the appeal, but not like, oh, wow, this is a bundle of joy that you would shine light into. Like, it doesn't seem like that at all. It seems like, her whole thing is, I learned what everyone has told me about what's happening to the planet. And I got really depressed. And then I decided to do something about it. And if you look at what she's done, is she just shames adults. She just says, you've made the world terrible and you should be ashamed of yourself and you're not doing enough to undo. Now, my whole perspective is the adults have made the world amazing. So your Greta has more opportunity than any human being has ever had, but she's cashing in on people thinking the planet was perfect. We ruined it. And there's so much, and you don't want to be a planet destroyer or you don't want to be a climate change denier. There's all this. So people have guilt about what we've done to the planet. And they don't want to be shamed as one of the people who's in that camp. So they'll do everything they can to get the status of, I want to save the planet. A lot of it is about status, because if you look at the actions, like there are lots of people who just feel like, oh, well, I believe in climate change and I want to do something. And they don't really change their lifestyles. Like, I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio travels on yachts, right? And all these guys fly to their things with private jets, but they want the status of the world saver, and they do not want the status of being the negative status of being involved with fossil fuels. And so I think there's so many negative dynamics, but they all proceed from, I think, the wrong framework. And being from philosophy, that's my focus, is what's our starting point? What's our framework? And is it good to impact the planet, or is it bad? And is impact generally beneficial to human life, or is it self-destructive? And I think if you have this view that human flourishing is what matters, then you have to think, well, impact it's crucial to human flourishing. So it's mostly good. It's good if it's intelligent, and it's not going to lead to self-destruction. It's going to lead to a better and better life over time as we create resources, and we also neutralize all the different threats of nature, including climate, which climate is, people think of, we could talk a lot about it, but people think of climate as something that was just like the planet was perfect and we ruined it. They think, oh, the climate was safe and now we made it dangerous. Whereas empirically, actually, the death rate from climate is down 98% in the last 100 years. So actually, your likelihood of dying from climate is 1 in 50 compared to what it would be 100 years ago. So climate is another thing where human beings haven't made it worse. We've actually made it much better.
Yeah, and I also wanted to, let's go into climate change, because I think it'd be a travesty not to go into it whilst I've got this short amount of time I have with you, and I think this is so important. How should we start with this? Because I think this is a big subject, and I think I'd like to do this justice. Maybe if we could start off with greenhouse gases in general, carbon dioxide, how it forms, and you know, what they say is that this threshold of carbon dioxide is what's going to cause climate catastrophe. And I think there's also, I want to go into the 97% as well. I want us to knock that out the park as well, because I think that is something that your moderates that you speak to will always refer back to that. So would it be okay if I let you take the reins here?
I'll try to break it down
for us
in terms of how I think about it. And I'll try to build on what I've talked about before. So my framework, I'd call my own framework like the human flourishing framework. So I'm evaluating things by how good they are for human flourishing. And I recognize that we live on an imperfect planet that we need to dramatically transform. And so we're looking at anything, fossil fuels or anything else, we need to look at it from that perspective. I mentioned we need to look at the benefits and the side effects of everything, and we need to look at it with precision. So one thing is, the first thing to say about CO2 is that it's a side effect. So when we're thinking about CO2 and so-called climate change, we always need to then integrate that with the benefits we get from fossil fuels. Just like if you found the side effect of a drug, you need to integrate that. So we can focus on CO2, but we have to recognize it's always part of a bigger picture. And so that's one thing that's not done by almost anyone. It's always climate change is its own issue. And that's like saying, oh, vaccine side effects are their own issue. Let's have a conference about vaccine side effects. Let's have a conference about antibiotic side effects. Well, you can't do that without talking about the benefits of vaccines and or the benefits of antibiotics. So that's one thing. Now, when you're looking at the side effect, so let's focus on CO2 now, you have to look at it from the perspective not of minimal impact or unchanged nature, but human flourishing. So when we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere, we have to be clear, the potential problem with that is not that it changes the atmosphere. Change by human beings is not inherently bad or good. It's only a problem if it's a negative change for human flourishing. And that's where a lot of people get tripped up, is they assume that any climate change is bad, and they really assume that it's catastrophic. And that's not an assumption we can have. So I do believe that CO2 has impacts on climate, but that's not to say that it's even bad, let alone that it's catastrophically bad. And so then I think if you look at it so you get rid of the whole anti-impact religion, anti-impact framework, you look at it from a human flourishing framework, then you can be much more clinical about it and not have all this religiosity associated with it. And then you have to look at, okay, what's the nature of the gas? And there are two attributes of it. It's a warming gas that are relevant here. It's a warming gas and it's a fertilizing gas. So it's a warming gas in the sense that the higher the concentration of it in the atmosphere, through a bunch of mechanisms, basically, the warmer the influence it has. So if you put more of it in the atmosphere, all things being equal, it's going to have a warming influence. The other thing is that it has a fertilizing influence. So if you put more CO2 in a greenhouse, the plants grow much more. And so that for human flourishing, that should be a sign. You were going to say something.
Sorry, yeah. Could we pause on that one? Because I just want us to go into that a little bit more. So I've spoken about this before with people where the more the CO2 level, the more the plants grow. But the argument that they always give for that is there's only a certain amount of threshold that the plants can absorb through carbon dioxide. If there's an increase in carbon dioxide, it doesn't necessarily mean that more plants are going to grow. Would you mind just quickly breaking that down?
I mean, that's theoretically true, but it has nothing to do with the levels we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so most of the plants that we have on Earth have origins in periods of the planet, and this is going to be relevant anyway to the warming issue, periods of the planet's history where there's 10 times or 5 or 10 times higher CO2 levels than even our supposedly high CO2 levels today, which are actually very low in terms of the history of the planet. So we have huge periods of the planet's history where the planet was a much lusher place because it had more CO2 and there was more fertilization. So we know that there was that a lot of the plants we have benefit from way more CO2. And just as a commercial thing, greenhouse growers will often double or triple the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And they're actually paying for more CO2 in the atmosphere to grow plants. So in my book, in I think it's chapter 4, in chapter 4, I show just very clearly every crop benefiting from elevated levels of CO2. So people can make a statement. It's a legitimate thing to think about. Yeah, what's the threshold at which it can absorb it? But it's a very high threshold that we're nowhere near close to meeting. So from the perspective of the plants, they would want way more CO2 than we have, or even than we know how to emit, even if we're just optimizing for that. The other thing is that they also have this amazing part of the fertilizer effect. And I'll talk about warming in a second, but part of the fertilizer effect is they actually decrease the plant's need for water. And so what you see around the globe is we've had massive global greening, particularly in dry areas, because in the drier areas with less rainfall, the plants can grow better the more CO2 is in the atmosphere. And so part of the reason to bring this up is not to steer away from the issue of warming, which I want to talk about in a second, but is to look at what it looks like to look at this issue from a human perspective. And that means you look at benefits and side effects. And even when you're looking at the side effects, you have to look at, are there any beneficial side effects? Or you could call them byproducts. Are there any beneficial byproducts? You can't assume that if we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere, it has to be all bad. You have to look at it empirically from a human perspective. And the fact that we're massively greening the earth, that is a very big potential benefit. It leads to more biomass, more plant life in in all the ecosystems, which that can lead to more of any species that we care about or want, but it also directly increases our agricultural yields. And it's relevant to the fact that we have record agricultural yields. It's not the only cause. I think machine power from fossil fuels is the main cause, but it definitely contributes to more crop growth. And that means people can acquire more food in less time. 200 years ago in Britain, one of the wealthiest places in the world, 80% of people's income went to food. Think about that. And they did not have good food. It wasn't like, oh, they're buying Whole Foods, right? It was more like crusts of bread. So it's this plant growth effect, this fertilizer effect is amazing. So let's talk about the warming influence now. And that's what everyone thinks, oh, well, that's so bad. But even if you think about that, is warming bad? Well, it depends. I mean, you could imagine in your mind, oh, it would warm so much that the whole planet would become uninhabitable. But if you look at the history of the planet has had 15 times more CO2 than it had today. And it actually doesn't correlate all that well with warming. So it's not like the CO2 and the warming just always go together. Sometimes they're even opposing. So there's many other dynamics driving temperature. But it's clear that like what we see from the history of the planet, it's not true that if you even double or triple the CO2 that you get some out of control warming. That just simply hasn't happened even. So then you're looking at fairly modest amounts of warming. And another attribute of the way the greenhouse effect works is it's concentrated more in cold areas. So the colder parts of the planet tend to warm, so nearer the poles. That's why there's so much focus on the poles, but that's actually a good thing because it means that, like we used to have palm trees there. It means that the equator doesn't get super hot. It's the planet becomes more tropical, both because of the fertilization, but also the warming. So you can't just assume warming is bad. You have to recognize that, well, warming the colder parts of the earth, that has a whole bunch of benefits to it. And that's generally what human beings have wanted throughout history. That's why the real climate refugees, as they call them, they're not people fleeing hot places, they're fleeing cold places. They move to places like California, Southern California, where I live. So we could talk about some of the other things like storms and floods and whatnot, but if you look at the basic things of, it's a fertilizing gas and a warming gas, those both have particularly it warms cold places, those are both very desirable qualities. And the fact that we never talk about the benefits of fertilization and we never talk about any benefits of warming, and we look at it as all bad, that shows there's this religious anti-impact framework driving it, where we just think, oh, if we're impacting it, it must be bad, even if it's generally making our planet more lush and more tropical, which is what most people want. Now, so then there's to sort of shorten it, there's the other thing about the greenhouse effect that explains why the temperature doesn't go out of control is it's what's called a decelerating or logarithmic effect. And that means that every new molecule of CO2 you add has some warming influence, but it has less of a warming influence than the last. So you can think of it as similar to when you're driving your car, like you have an optimal fuel efficiency, let's say 55 miles an hour. And then after that, when you press on the gas, like each molecule of gasoline generates less power than the previous one. So if you put it all the way down, it gives you more, but it doesn't take you to 1,000,000 miles an hour, right? It might only take you to 100 or 120. So it levels off, and that's how the greenhouse effect works. So there's some complexities to that, but basically it's a decelerating effect. So what in practice, it means that to get a given amount of warming, other things be equal, you have to double the amount of CO2. So let's say we started off with 0.027% CO2. We'd have to get to 0.054%. That's 540 parts per million. We're at about 400 or 410 right now to get a certain amount of warming, but then to get the same amount of warming. So let's say that was 2 degrees Celsius we got to get another 2, you'd have to get it to 1080. And then to another, you'd have to do 2160. And we don't really know how to do that. So so you've got this thing where it's a fertilizing influence, it's a warming influence in colder places, and it's a decelerating warming influence. If we just understand the basic mechanics of it, it's very implausible that it could lead to something that's some kind of huge catastrophe. And then you hear also, oh, well, it's making storms worse and floods. I mean, floods are a little more plausible because of sea level rise. Sea level rise is actually a plausible thing. But if you think of like storms and wildfire and drought, the idea, just think logically about if we're making a more tropical world, is it really going to be, I mean, maybe more storms, although for various reasons, the less difference in temperature between the poles and the equator creates less energy for storms. But if you just think about like wildfires and drought, if you're in a warmer world, that means more precipitation. How is that going to consistently lead to drought everywhere? How is that consistently going to lead to more wildfires? And wildfire is a whole issue.
That's crazy enough, is it in itself?
Human mistakes. Yeah. Right. So what you have to recognize is that the whole interpretation of climate science is driven by this religious anti-impact framework, where we just expect impacting the planet to be bad, even if physically it makes no sense. Because physically it makes no sense to say, if we warm the colder parts of the planet, then everything is going to go to hell. That's a religious type of view. And when you look into it, you see, yeah, there aren't really interesting trends as we've warmed the planet in terms of storms and floods, et cetera. And sea level rise, that is a real thing, but we're not warming it very quickly. The rise is very slow. Sea level is much more affected by local factors, like do you have a lot of mass on the land like Miami? That's why they have sea level issues. So it's those kinds of things. Plus, and this is the maybe most important element, human adaptation, or what I call human mastery of climate, that enables us to deal with any kind of climate change. We've made the naturally dangerous climate much safer through climate mastery. And so in sea levels, we have 110 million people around the world who live below sea level. 110 million people live below sea level. How is it that sea level rises are going to be some huge problem? Very slow. It's not going to happen. So I think if you recognize both the actual nature of CO2 and you recognize that the CO2, it comes with a lot of energy, and that energy helps us master climate by using machines to take dangerous climate and make it safe, then your expectation is going to be for the same reasons that climate has gotten 50 times safer in the last 100 years. If we keep using fossil fuels, however it changes or not, we'll keep getting safer from climate and life will keep getting better.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. That was a pretty profound encapsulation of everything that we
So,
need to know about carbon
sorry, I went on so long, but I thought I would just break it down.
No,
That's how I think about it.
It really needed you just to break that down into one comprehensive breakdown for everyone, just to hear, just like have that, you know. We're going to have to wrap up soon. I thought what I would like to do, I'd love to get your take on the 97% science, because I think once we have this out into the ether, out into the social media world, I think this would really start to wake people up, because I've always wanted someone just to break this apart. Maybe could you do it in maybe 5 minutes, and then we can go on to your book?
Yeah, I could definitely do it in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And also, if you look up 97% and Alex Epstein, I have a Forbes article that has 1 million views on it, and I have a Prager University video that has probably 3 million views on it. But let me explain the basic fallacy very quickly, and then we can go into some of the details.
Yeah.
If you heard us, let's say somebody was against antibiotics, and they said, I did a study, and it said 97% of doctors say that antibiotic side effects are real. Would you be against antibiotics? 97% of doctors say...
I shouldn't be. No, not if you say like that. If they're real,
no,
but it's like...
Of course they have side effects, but what are the benefits, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And so 97% of climate scientists say that climate change is real, or sometimes say that we're contributing to global warming, or even we're the main cause of global warming. All that amounts to is saying 97% of climate scientists say that fossil fuels have some climate side effects. That doesn't mean fossil fuels are bad. It doesn't mean there's climate catastrophe. It just means they cause some influence on climate, which I've been talking about. I 100% agree with. And so it's the main thing is equating some climate influence with catastrophic climate change with get rid of fossil fuels. So you can't equate any of those three things. You can't equate fossil fuels have some side effects to they have catastrophic side effects to we should get rid of them. Because even if they have catastrophic side effects, you might think, well, the way to deal with them, and I think this would be true, the way to deal with them is to make sure that people still use a lot of them so we can use machine power to make ourselves safe, like to make sure we have extra air conditioning and extra heating and extra seawalls and that kind of thing. So it's called the fallacy of equivocation in philosophy, which is you're using a term to mean multiple different things to manipulate people. So the main thing is that the object of agreement in 97% is a manipulative equivocation. And the real object of agreement is a mild side effect that doesn't at all justify depriving us of the benefits of fossil fuels. But then if you look into it, which I talk about in the book and some of these other things, it's even more of a manipulation because they actually can't even get 97% of climate scientists to say that fossil fuels are the main cause of the 1 degree, and I should emphasize 1 degree of warming that we've had in the last 170 years. They can't do that when they've done, they can get a majority sometimes if they do a survey, but these surveys are just total BS. And so and now this is not the most important point, but it's relevant to how much the media manipulates things. They basically what they do is they have a conclusion, which is fossil fuels are the main cause of warming. Main means 50% or more. And then they take any paper that says fossil fuels have any warming influence, and then they say, oh, this counts as this. But to say some warming influence isn't the same as saying 50% or more. Those are just different things. It'd be like if, you saying something contributed to my success. Like if I say being on the Men Improvement podcast contributed to my success in the future, that may be true. Say it contributed to 50%, I sure as hell hope so. But 50% is a lot. And with climate, there are a lot of different factors. So there's just this, it's not even true. The 97% thing wouldn't be a big deal if it were true. And it's not even true. It's not even true that 97% agree that fossil fuel CO2 emissions are the main cause of the mild warming that has existed. So it's
actually
insignificant conclusion, which there is not agreement about.
And there's actually more like 1.3% when you actually break it down.
Well, yeah, when you look at that's not the level of agreement, but and I explain that in the Forbes article and in my book, but the Forbes article you can get for free. It's called 97% of climate scientists agree is 100% wrong. So it's explaining how it's wrong. It's that their actual survey only did its job for 1.3% of the papers. So it's not that 1.3% agree with that. It's just they have no idea. It's just they were getting, you can't poll people by reading their papers. And if their papers mention global warming with no percentage attribution, you can't say, oh, you must have meant 50%. That's just totally dishonest.
Yeah, and actually people coming forward and saying that's totally misrepresented my views of my...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like Richard Toll, this economist, and some others. And I would just ask people who use that statistic, I would ask them, two questions, at least. What do they agree on exactly? Because that's really important. And then how do you know they agree? Because they're so revealing, as nobody knows the whole sausage making of this 97% BS. And yet we repeat it. So that shows how shallow and dangerous our relationship with science is in this culture. And I think we've seen this with the coronavirus stuff as well, where just one media outlet tells you that all scientists say something and you believe that. That just means the media is your God and you just followed it like a religious text.
Absolutely.
That's what it means.
Well,
it doesn't mean that you surveyed the science. It means that you just passively, anyone who uses the word science and happens to be in your field, you are just going to follow what they say more or less dictatorially. That's a scary prospect. So if you want to believe what scientists say, you need to know, A, what did they say? How do you know they said it? And what is their evidence for it? You can't just say, somebody told you 97% of scientists say do this. Oh, I'm going to do that. That's not science.
It's easy. It's an easy bite-sized bit of information for them just to take in, to then go out into the world and start propagating to other people. I mean, we have a TV show called 8 out of 10 Cats, and it's based on the advert, 8 out of 10 cats prefer this cat food. And it's exactly the same logic, you know, and it's unfortunate that most people sort of are eating that like cats are eating their cat food. I wanted to finish off with this one thing, because you mentioned COVID there. And in your book, you mentioned about Prince Philip talks about, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to control, to solve overpopulation. We have Bill Gates talking about overpopulation. We have David, you mentioned David M. Graeber, I think, or Graeber. He says, until such time as Homo sapiens should decide to rejoin nature, some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along. I mean, this is almost like, is this not sort of preemptively telling us what's happening at the moment? I mean, would you like to go into that? Is that something you'd like to go into?
Well, just look at the reaction to it. I mean, what has been the dominant reaction to COVID? I mean, we could talk about all the prescriptions and stuff, and were they based on science? But look at the reaction in terms of talking about the planet and environment. The whole view has been, oh, it's been a godsend for the environment. The planet's such a nicer place. Like there's less smog here and there's less pollution there. Like that's the ultimate looking at side effects and not looking at benefits. You're basically saying, oh, some side effects disappeared. Isn't that fantastic? And billions of people are suffering. I think a lot of the lockdown policies are unnecessary, so I think unnecessarily, but in any case, they're suffering massively precisely because they cannot do the things that use fossil fueled machines that were benefiting their lives. So they're not able to visit their relatives. They can't go to their job. Sometimes they can't do their job. There's all sorts of things, it's more expensive to produce food. Like all these things about our world that's generally improving have gotten a lot worse when we're not free to move around, including we're not free to use all the machines involved in moving us around. So I would say the world has become a much worse place to live since the COVID and lockdowns. Yeah. And yet the modern environmental movement views it as a better place. And they keep saying, well, we have to preserve the gains of COVID and let's have a green restart. And basically, no, we've experienced a small taste of what their green world would be like, and it is very undesirable. So it just shows they're not looking at the world from a human perspective. They're looking at it from an anti-human perspective. The whole focus is let's dehumanize the planet. Let's stop ruining it with our impacts. And that's a very revealing thing versus we should say, no, planet has gotten worse. The world has gotten worse by less human impact. Let's get back to a stage where we're impacting it, where we're using machines, where we're improving our lives. And let's look forward to a much better one. Sure, we can do things to minimize pollution we don't like. We have technologies to do that as poor people become wealthier. They can do that. But we have to keep in mind the world has never been a better place to live. It's getting better quickly. COVID should be hopefully a blip. It shouldn't be a directional change.
Mm. But thank you for that. I was just wondering, though, based upon what we've noticed with the data and the propaganda and the deceit and the lies, is it quite possible that this could be its own version of like Al Gore's climate change agenda in terms of COVID, in terms of like skewing the data, making up the figures, making us feel as though it's this big catastrophe when really it's probably, you know, a tiny, tiny insignificance really, but it's been blown out of proportion to force a political agenda.
Well, I mean, one thing is that you have to look at, so there's always an issue with anything of being precise about its magnitude. And so
Yeah.
if something is a real threat, if you magnify it into 8 times the threat it is, and you ask for an 8 times disproportionate response, that is a very bad thing. You can't just say, oh, I don't want people to die, so I get to do anything I want, including kill people like Andrew Cuomo in New York, basically. But it's killing people, funneling old people, funneling COVID patients into nursing homes, but it's also just ruining everyone's life. And there's just been so little focus on how much it ruins everyone's life to friggin' lock them down in their own homes, let alone ruining their health. So I've been talking about this a lot on my podcast, Power Hour, and I talk about it on Twitter at Alex Epstein. What was I going to say? But what you can see for sure without any kind of conspiracy type things is that there are people who are statists, meaning they believe that power should be concentrated in the state. And the idea of controlling people very strongly, including just keeping them in their homes for months at a time, does not bother them. And so that's revealing that their framework is very much power should be concentrated in the state. And it has this pseudoscientific view of, it should be concentrated in the form of experts like me. So if I say don't wear a mask, then no one should wear a mask. And if I say wear a mask, everyone should wear a mask. And I don't even need an explanation of why I switched from don't wear a mask to wear a mask. And if I'm telling you that you shouldn't go to the beach to prevent something that dies in sunlight, dies in humidity, and that doesn't succeed in well-ventilated areas, like I don't have to explain myself. So there's a total appeal that people have to a statist country where individuals are dictated by individuals who claim to have science, but don't need to persuade anyone of their science. They just get to dictate that. And you see a lot of commonality with that. And the climate stuff, where it's just, we need a new form of government where everyone gets to, the quote scientists, which just means whatever science I can manipulate, whoever supports my policies, where they're just going to control everybody in the name of science. So I do think you don't need to have like, it's a pandemic or something, or these guys gathered in a room. It's more like, I don't know even where the virus came from, but it's the framework of people who believe in statism and basically having pseudoscientific dictators that is clearly dominating our country right now. And I think we have to rebel against that, as that's immoral and it's not scientific. If you've got really good ideas about how to deal with a virus, why don't you freaking explain them to me and then let me follow them for myself? Now, if you can prove that I'm a carrier of a dangerous disease and it passes a certain threshold, I think it's okay to say, yeah, you should quarantine. But that's if you are actually, like, governments, a simple way to think of it is governments actually have to have evidence that you're doing something wrong to compel you. They don't get to dictate to you by saying, you might be doing something wrong. You might commit a murder, so you can't leave your house. You might have COVID, so you can't leave. No, that is an immoral government. It's not scientific. And that's what I think about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, scientism, I call that. Yeah, it would have been great to go on with you because you got such a passion for this that when you talk, just like I could just leave you and just walk out the room and you'd be still like giving us so much great information.
Well, I hope I'm not. I don't mean to be ranting too much, but you're asking good questions, and I'm
Alex,
trying to break it down
it's just
systematically.
I had so many questions. I had another one here that we're probably not going to get time for, but I asked the audience to put some questions forward, and I actually picked the best question out. I'll read it out, but maybe we can, maybe get you on another time.
We could also do something. I have a few minutes, and we could also do something where I just give you 20-second answers. I could do like 20-second answers.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah, we could do a quick. Fire,
like an oral tweet.
There we go. Yeah, this is quite a long one, but if you could give quite a short tweet answer for this one. He says modern economies are based around oil, and most wars are fought over it. Even Vietnam involved oil. The Rockefellers' wealth also all comes from oil, and they are, as a family, have caused immense damage to human civilization and human happiness. The modern drug pharmaceutical industry is a result of oil. So many things come from the oil industry: plastics that pollute the oceans, pesticides, herbicides, and they want to know can Alex see any viable oil alternatives in the near future? How long does he think he will be able to keep extracting it from the earth? And will that extraction process have any long-term effects? It's a long answer, isn't
question
it?
itself is the question itself is flagrantly committing the error of ignoring the benefits
Right.
and only focusing on and exaggerating the side effects. So that's one thing, and the other is there's plenty of oil that technology can extract for a long time, and there's nothing close to it for a while. But if we decriminalize nuclear, maybe it can replace some of the functionality of oil, but that requires a big change in policy.
Fantastic. Yeah, he did say more, but we don't really have time. So I did a tweet-sized question, but he does actually says he can see the benefits of it, but he wants to know the way up of it, the balance of it. All right. So I'd just like to say, Alex, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, your passion is just, for all to see. You've been on a mission for quite a while with this, and I really commend you for being someone that's able to break apart paradigms, be an outlier, because that takes a lot of bravery to stand up against like massive industries and actually just speak your truth and really stand up there. And I know you debated, a top environmentalist, a few years ago, I think it was, and that took you crowdfunded it, and that took a lot of courage to do that.
Yeah, I still do. I debated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. last year, actually.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, so I mean, look, this is why you're on Raising the Bar, because I want to bring people on and we can raise the bar, we can lift our awareness, lift our level of education and our understanding, and we can all lift up together and transcend and include effectively. So Alex, just like to say your book was brilliant. It's written in a very accessible way, very easy to read. It's a sort of book that you could provide give to anyone, your family, your friends, your nan. They would all be able to read that and all be able to take something from it. It's not too densely written. It's not too it's not too chewy to read. It's quite a nice read as well, and it's very balanced. And I think you lay out a pretty solid argument. I think it's almost irrefutable, really, when you really look at the hard data. You provide a lot of information there, graphs and everything. You're showing the correlations and everything else. So it's fantastic. The name of that is The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. It's out now, but there's also a second edition coming out, I believe, next February. Is that right?
Hopefully. I'm finishing it now.
Okay, yeah.
So I would recommend get the first one if you find this interesting. But at the very least, I'd post a lot on social media, so you can find me there. But maybe the best way to get my stuff, if you go to the site industrialprogress.com, that's industrialprogress.com. We have a weekly mailing list, and that I just send out once a week stuff like this. So if you like this interview and you want to hear about the latest stuff, just get on that mailing list.
There we go, guys. Please check Alex out. He is a real, trooper when it comes to this sort of stuff, and a real thought leader. So, Alex, all that's left to be said is thanks for coming on Raising the Bar, and hopefully we can have you on next time and go into more depths of these things.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. All the best. There you have it, guys. Alex Epstein, and it was brilliant to bring him on because I'm sure when you heard the book title, A Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, you had that knee-jerk reaction maybe, oh my God, how can you be saying that? I certainly did. And that is an indictment of the society that we're in and the way that we're programmed to see fossil fuels as this dirty, destructive element. And I think Alex puts a pretty strong case forward that actually fossil fuels is actually improving human life. It's increasing life expectancy, increasing average income, lowering infant mortality rates, generally making the world a more livable place for us to reside, and the quality of life is improving, and that's something we're not taught. In fact, we're bombarded with the opposite of that, which is fossil fuels are going to destroy the planet, and you're not a good person unless you get on the green train, the Green New Deal train, and if you don't, then you're a pretty nasty piece of work. And so Alex makes the case that actually it should be celebrated and championed that fossil fuels has pulled us out of poverty and really done good things for humanity, mankind. So that was Raising the Bar with Alex Epstein. I thought that was a fantastic episode. He was so passionate, he could have just gone on forever. But if you like the show, please leave a like, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.